December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, an expanse of pines and rolling hills cloaked under fresh snow. The calm of that bitter morning shattered as the German army unleashed a massive counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands of American troops, many new to combat, suddenly found themselves surrounded by fog, confusion, and fire. Among them was a small reconnaissance patrol from the 106th Infantry Division's 422nd Regiment. 5 men tasked with observing enemy activity near the Belgian village of Schönberg. None of them could have known that within hours, they would vanish without a trace. The 106th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Golden Lions, had only recently arrived on the Western Front. Positioned along a quiet sector of the Ardennes, their line was considered a rest area. But the Germans, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had chosen this very region for their surprise winter offensive. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, aimed to split the Allied forces and seize Antwerp. The quiet sector suddenly became the center of the storm. At dawn, Captain Harold Knox, commander of the regiment's intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, received reports of unusual vehicle movement near Losheim Gap. He ordered a small patrol, Sergeant David R. Lewis and 4 men, to investigate the area east of Schönberg. Their assignment was simple: confirm enemy strength and direction, then report back by radio. The men checked their M1 carbines, loaded their jeep, and disappeared into the mist. For a time, the patrol's radio transmissions came through clearly. They reported the sound of engines, possibly German half-tracks, somewhere near the forest line. Then the static grew louder. The final words received were fragmented: heavy traffic, snowed road, approaching crossroad, and then silence. Back at division headquarters in St. Vith, Knox tried repeatedly to re-establish contact. The signal never returned. Initially, no one panicked. In those conditions, radio failure was common. But as hours passed and the thunder of artillery drew closer, unease set in. Reports began flooding in from forward observers. Enemy tanks were moving through the Losheim Gap, and entire communications lines were collapsing. The area where the patrol had gone was now behind enemy lines. An artillery lieutenant later recalled seeing a jeep with 5 Americans heading east along a narrow logging trail around mid-morning. They waved, he said, and then disappeared into the fog. We thought they were falling back. But the direction didn't make sense. They were moving toward German positions. It was the last confirmed sighting of the patrol. By late afternoon, the front was in chaos. German armored spearheads from the 1st SS Panzer Division had broken through, severing key roads. The 106th's command posts were being encircled. Units were ordered to withdraw toward St. Vith, but many were cut off or captured. In that confusion, the fate of a single reconnaissance team seemed a small concern amid thousands of men trapped in encirclement. Yet their disappearance would become one of the division's most puzzling wartime mysteries. The following morning, when command regrouped west of St. Vith, the missing patrol was officially listed as unaccounted for. Knox filed a brief entry in his field notebook. Recon patrol, 5 men. Last report December 16, 44, Schönberg sector. Presumed lost during advance. It was routine language, meant to be temporary. But the names would never be crossed off that list. In the days that followed, the Golden Lions suffered catastrophic losses. 2 entire regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender. Over 7,000 men captured near Schnee-Eifel. Amid the chaos of the Ardennes, it was easy for a small patrol to vanish completely. Still, rumors spread among survivors. Stories of a captured jeep, of bodies found in an abandoned barn, of prisoners seen marching east. None were confirmed. Military historians later noted how unprepared many units were for reconnaissance in deep snow and freezing fog. The visibility was barely 50 yards. The forest absorbed sound, making it impossible to orient by echo or engine noise. Navigation relied on frozen dirt tracks and paper maps, tools that failed easily in the blizzard conditions of December 1944. The men of the patrol, trained for observation, found themselves in a battlefield that swallowed sound, direction, and memory. One diary entry recovered years later from a 106th Division survivor captures the tone of those early days. The woods felt alive but empty. You could hear armor rumbling miles away, and then nothing. Men walked into the fog and didn't come back. By the third day of the offensive, Schönberg had fallen to the Germans. Any chance of finding the patrol vanished with it. Whether they had been ambushed, captured, or lost in the blinding snow, no trace remained. Officially, their status was changed from missing in action to presumed captured. Unofficially, among the men who knew them, they were simply gone. As Allied forces struggled to hold St. Vith, whispers circulated of strange German movements, convoys traveling under cover of fog, using American vehicles and uniforms to confuse sentries. Some officers wondered, had the patrol stumbled into one of these operations? Or had they witnessed something not meant to be seen? Whatever the truth, the forest kept its silence. Snow buried the tracks, fog erased the trails, and the war moved on. Yet for those who served in the 106th, the question lingered. What happened to the men who drove east that morning and never returned? December 17, 1944, dawn broke gray and heavy over the Ardennes. The storm that had hidden the German advance still hung in the air, muffling sound and blurring the outlines of trees and hills. For the men of the 106th Infantry Division, the situation was rapidly unraveling. Schönberg had fallen under German control overnight, and what remained of the American lines was fragmenting under the pressure of advancing armor. Amid the confusion, one question haunted Captain Harold Knox and his staff. What had become of the reconnaissance patrol sent out the previous morning? Their last confirmed sighting, according to Lieutenant Robert Haynes of the 589th Field Artillery, was around mid-morning on December 16. They passed our battery, moving east, Haynes later recalled. There was heavy fog, visibility maybe 20 yards. We waved. They waved back. Then they disappeared into the white. The jeep had been heading directly toward Schönberg, which was already crawling with German forward elements. Within hours, radio traffic ceased entirely. As German armored columns from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, pressed through the Losheim Gap, entire sections of the American line were overrun or bypassed. The 422nd and 423rd Regiments found themselves surrounded on all sides. The Recon patrol's assigned sector became a battlefield maze of fallen trees, destroyed vehicles, and shattered communications. When Knox tried to send another team to re-establish contact, they never got more than a mile before running into enemy machine gun fire. Meanwhile, confusion reigned across the American command. Units were operating on outdated maps. Roads marked as clear were already occupied by German tanks. Supply convoys were ambushed in the mist. In the chaos, the disappearance of a 5-man patrol might have seemed insignificant. But in reality, such reconnaissance units were the division's eyes and ears. Their reports often determined the survival of entire battalions. What made this disappearance so strange was its suddenness and the absence of any evidence. No destroyed jeep, no wounded, no sign of capture. By mid-afternoon, the enemy had taken control of Schönberg's bridge over the Our River, severing the only escape route west. The patrol would have had to turn back through open terrain, now crawling with German infantry. There was almost no chance they could have made it. Knox recorded one last radio attempt at 1,540 hours. "Recon patrol, this is command, do you read?" The reply never came. By nightfall, German flares illuminated the sky over Schönberg, marking positions for artillery fire. American units were forced into desperate fighting withdrawals. The missing men were assumed dead or captured. But the lack of bodies, wreckage, or confirmation gnawed at Knox's mind. A diary entry from Private Jack Harrison of the 106th gives a glimpse of the mounting dread among the troops. "The fog was so thick you could barely see your rifle barrel. We heard engines, maybe tanks, maybe our own. The woods felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by things unseen, moving all around us." That night, German infiltrators disguised in American uniforms began appearing behind Allied lines, part of Otto Skorzeny's Operation Greif, designed to sow confusion. Some officers speculated that the missing patrol had encountered one of these teams. The men might have been captured quietly, their jeep repainted or reused in deception operations. Others believed the patrol had been ambushed by the lead elements of Kampfgruppe paper, the infamous SS unit known for its speed and ruthlessness. Eyewitnesses from nearby villages later recalled hearing gunfire and engine noise deep in the forest around noon on the 16th, then silence. When locals ventured out days later, they found burned-out vehicles, bodies frozen where they fell, but none matched the description of the missing jeep or its crew. The patrol had simply vanished. As German forces advanced westward, the fog thickened again. American artillery shelled the forest indiscriminately to slow the enemy. If the patrol was still alive, they would have been caught between the two lines, stranded in no man's land, without supplies or radio contact, hunted by both sides. In war, such disappearances were not uncommon, but this one carried peculiar weight. These were trained reconnaissance men, familiar with the terrain. For them to vanish so completely defied expectation. In later years, when veterans of the 106th looked back on those freezing days, many recalled the eerie stillness that followed the storm. "You could hear battle in every direction," one survivor said. "But sometimes there were these sudden silences, like the whole forest was holding its breath." That silence, it seemed, had swallowed the patrol whole. By December 18th, the situation for the division had become desperate. Orders came to retreat toward St. Vith and regroup. Schunberg was firmly in enemy hands. The names of Sergeant David Lewis and his 4 men were written on a growing list of the missing. For now, their fate remained one more unanswered question amid the fog and fury of the Ardennes. As command withdrew west, Captain Knox looked one last time toward the smoke rising from Schunberg. "If they're out there," he reportedly said, "the forest has them now." He couldn't have known how prophetic those words would become. Because even after the guns fell silent, long after the snow had melted, no one would ever find a single trace of that vanished patrol. December 18th, 1944, the third day of the German counteroffensive. The Battle of the Bulge was raging at full force, and the American front in the Ardennes had splintered into confusion. Blizzards swept through the forests, erasing tracks and covering the dead in fresh layers of snow. To the west, St. Vith was under threat. To the east, Schunberg and the surrounding hills were now deep within enemy territory. And somewhere in that frozen no-man's land, 5 men from the 106th Infantry Division's Recon section had simply disappeared. As reports of ambushes and missing units poured in, the division's intelligence officers began to piece together fragments of what might have happened. Across multiple sectors, reconnaissance and forward observation teams had gone missing. Small groups sent to monitor German movements who never reported back. It was as if the forest itself was swallowing them. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Fuller, the division's operations officer, later wrote in his journal, "Our patrols are not returning. Either they've run into armor or been taken by surprise. Enemy infiltration is far more extensive than we thought." The 1st SS Panzer Division, led by Joachim Paper, was advancing rapidly westward, using narrow forest trails to bypass resistance. Their armored spearhead crushed through villages like Bullingen and Lignaville, leaving behind burned vehicles and executed prisoners. If the missing U.S. patrol had been caught anywhere near these movements, their chances of survival were slim. Yet no reports mentioned a captured American jeep, nor did any German field records list additional prisoners from that area. A small rescue effort was organized on the 19th, 2 jeeps and a half-track under Lieutenant Haynes. Their mission: locate the last known position of Sergeant Lewis's patrol near the Schunberg logging roads. The search team advanced cautiously along the Aar River, the landscape littered with the debris of battle. Burned trucks. Abandoned helmets half buried in snow. The wreckage of a Sherman tank lay smoldering beside the road. But as they approached the area, machine gun fire erupted from the tree line. The rescue team withdrew immediately. Schunberg was still in German hands. "We never even got close," Haynes later testified. "The entire area was crawling with enemy troops. Whatever happened to those boys? It was beyond our reach." Back at St. Vith, command operations were in turmoil. Orders were changing hourly. Supply lines were collapsing under relentless air attacks. The missing patrol became a footnote in a larger disaster as the 106th was encircled near Schnee, Eifel. Thousands of Americans were captured or killed in the following days. For the families of the missing recon team, there would be no word for months, only a notice marked, "Missing in Action, Belgium, December 1944. But the mystery deepened after the battle. In January 1945, when the Allies counterattacked and recaptured much of the Ardennes, search parties were dispatched to locate the remains of lost soldiers. Among them were teams from the Graves Registration Service and the Counter-Intelligence Corps. Near Schönberg, they combed the forests and ravines, interviewing villagers who had witnessed the fighting. Several locals spoke of a small American vehicle that had been seen on the morning of December 16th, heading east, then later heard exchanging gunfire near a farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. When U.S. investigators visited the site, they found shell casings and tracks frozen in ice, but no sign of the jeep or its occupants. More disturbing were reports from Belgian farmers who claimed they saw 5 Americans under guard by German soldiers around December 17th, being marched east through the snow. They looked exhausted, one villager told an Allied investigator. Their hands were bound. One of them was limping. We thought they would be sent to a camp. Yet when Allied forces reviewed captured German documents after the war, no record of such prisoners existed. Not one of the names from that patrol appeared in POW rosters or repatriation lists. The disappearance of prisoners was not unheard of during the Battle of the Bulge. Units like Kampfgruppe had little interest in transporting captives. Many were executed on the spot, as at Malmedy. But no bodies were ever found, and no known massacre sites in the region matched the description of the patrol's last location. It was as if they had been erased from the battlefield entirely. For military historians, the case exemplified the confusion of those days, the fog of war, both literal and psychological. The front shifted by the hour. Roads changed hands repeatedly. Records were destroyed or never kept. Yet there was something about this particular loss that defied normal explanation. How could 5 men, a jeep, weapons, and gear simply vanish in a heavily contested area without leaving a trace? One theory suggested they may have stumbled upon a German supply convoy or secret staging point. Another proposed they were mistaken for enemy infiltrators and shot by friendly fire, a grim possibility amid the paranoia of the Bulge, when soldiers were ordered to challenge anyone unfamiliar with questions about baseball or American slang. But again, no evidence surfaced. In February 1945, a memo from the 106th Division's intelligence office summarized the case succinctly. Reconnaissance Patrol, 5 personnel, missing since December 16, 44. Presumed captured or destroyed. No material evidence recovered. It was the final official word on the matter. Yet in later decades, veterans and researchers would continue to revisit the site, the snow-covered roads near Schönberg where the jeep was last seen disappearing into fog. Metal detectors, ground searches, and local archives turned up fragments, a rusted M1 carbine, a corroded U.S. insignia button, a bullet casing, but never enough to explain the full story. As one historian wrote years later, the Ardennes is filled with the ghosts of December 1944. Some are remembered by name, others are still buried beneath the snow. But a few simply vanished. And for Sergeant Lewis's patrol, the question would remain suspended in that winter fog. Did they fall in combat, or did they see something that made them disappear? January 1945, the snow began to thaw over the shattered Ardennes. After weeks of relentless fighting, the Allied counterattack was finally pushing the German army back toward the Rhine. The towns of St. Vith and Schönberg were little more than ruins, burned-out shells of their former selves, littered with wrecked vehicles and the remains of soldiers from both sides. Amid the grim work of reclaiming territory, American search and recovery teams were dispatched to locate their missing men. Among the names on their list was one entry that puzzled everyone who read it. Reconnaissance Patrol, 106th Infantry Division. Missing since December 16, 1944. Schönberg Sector. The mission to locate the missing patrol was assigned to the Graves Registration Service and the Counterintelligence Corps, both working in tandem with the 99th Infantry Division, which had taken over the area. Their task was methodical but grim, sifting through frozen fields, collapsed barns, and tree lines for signs of the hundreds still unaccounted for. Most missing soldiers were eventually found, buried hastily, frozen in foxholes, or left where they fell. but the 5 men of Sergeant David Lewis's team remained untraceable. Captain Harold Knox, now operating from a forward command post near St. Vith, personally visited the Schönberg area once it was deemed secure. What he saw left him uneasy. The village was nearly flattened. German tanks lay burnt out on the main road. The bridge over the Our River had been destroyed. The locals, emerging from cellars and barns, spoke cautiously to the Americans. When Knox showed them photos of the missing men, some nodded slowly. "We saw Americans," one elderly farmer said through a translator. "They came in a small jeep before the big fighting. We heard shooting near the woods later that day. Then, nothing." Knox and his team followed the man's directions to a small dirt track north of Schönberg, a road that wound through dense pine forest toward the Losheim Gap. There they found the first tangible clues: scattered shell casings, torn canvas, and a rusted jerry can stenciled U.S. Army. Nearby, half buried in snow, lay a field map covered in mud and blood. It was marked with pencil notes: bridge, destroyed, enemy armor, and a crude arrow pointing east toward a clearing labeled farmhouse. The handwriting was unmistakably Lewis's. The farmhouse still stood, abandoned and half-collapsed from shellfire. Inside, the walls were pocked with bullet holes. On the floor were the remains of a campfire and a single American ration tin. There were no bodies. No signs of struggle. Just the eerie silence of a place frozen in time. Knox noted everything in his report. Evidence suggests the patrol reached this position. Possible contact with enemy. No remains located. The report would later become one of the most detailed missing person cases filed during the Ardennes campaign. Over the next week, investigators combed the nearby woods. Metal detectors turned up spent .30 caliber cartridges and fragments of U.S.-issue webbing. The spacing of the casings indicated the men had fired in multiple directions, suggesting an ambush. But there were also 9mm shells scattered nearby, consistent with German sidearms. Whatever had happened there, it had been quick and close. Yet the strangest discovery came from a Belgian logger working the forest months later, after the thaw. He unearthed a piece of aluminum plating from beneath a tree root, apparently torn from a vehicle door. Stamped into the metal was a faint serial number beginning with W20, matching the series assigned to the division's reconnaissance jeeps. But the rest was illegible, and the rest of the vehicle was never found. Military investigators expanded their search radius, hoping to find graves or prisoner records. Nothing surfaced. Not in German archives, not in post-war Red Cross documents. By summer 1945, the official classification of the patrol's fate was changed from missing in action to missing, presumed dead. But for Captain Knox, the matter was anything but closed. In a letter to the families dated August 1945, he wrote, "Your sons carried out their duties under impossible conditions. We have found traces suggesting they engaged the enemy bravely. We regret that their remains have not yet been recovered. Please know they will not be forgotten." It was the kind of letter written countless times during the war, but Knox's felt different. He had seen enough to know the case was unusual. There was evidence of a firefight, but no aftermath. No captured equipment, no graves, no personal effects. It was as though the patrol had been lifted out of the landscape entirely. In 1947, during the post-war cleanup and repatriation of remains, another investigation was quietly reopened. This time, U.S. intelligence took an interest. Declassified files later revealed the reason. Rumors had emerged that the missing Recon patrol might have stumbled upon a German communication post hidden in the forest, a relay point for encrypted radio traffic used by Kampfgruppen's headquarters. Such a find could have compromised major operations. If true, it might explain why the men were never seen again. But those records, too, offered no resolution. The reports ended abruptly with the words, "No further information. Files closed." For decades after the war, veterans who served in the Ardennes spoke of the Schönberg Woods as a place of ghosts. Hunters occasionally found helmets, dog tags, or shrapnel there, but never the remains of Sergeant Lewis or his men. Even modern archaeological teams, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, found nothing beyond small fragments. The forest, it seemed, refused to give them up. And so, the story of the vanished Recon patrol passed quietly into the lore of the Battle of the Bulge. Not as a tale of heroism or defeat, but as one of mystery. A mission sent into the mist, a firefight that left no dead, and a trail that ended in silence. Whatever their fate, their disappearance remained a haunting reminder of how, in war, entire lives could vanish, leaving behind only the faintest traces in the snow. Spring, 1945, the snows of the Ardennes finally melted away, revealing the scars of one of Europe's fiercest battles. Allied forces now pushed deep into Germany, and the nightmare of the Bulge was slowly receding into memory. Yet for a handful of officers within the 106th Infantry Division, one story remained unresolved: the disappearance of Sergeant David Lewis and his reconnaissance patrol near Schönberg. While official reports closed the case as presumed dead, whispers and fragments of testimony kept the mystery alive. In the months following the German surrender, U.S. intelligence units began interviewing Belgian civilians and captured German officers to reconstruct the chaotic final days of the offensive. Among the reports filed to SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, were several peculiar accounts. One came from a Belgian farmer named Jules Vermeer, who lived along the Schönberg Road. He told investigators that, on December 17, 1944, he had seen 5 American soldiers being marched under guard by German troops. They were bound at the wrists, Vermeer said. One was wounded, limping. The Germans had pistols drawn. They headed east, toward the forest. Vermeer assumed they were prisoners of war, but when shown photographs later, he identified Sergeant Lewis and 2 others without hesitation. The U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps followed up by checking German POW lists and interrogation logs from December 1944 to January 1945. No corresponding entries were found. None of the 5 Americans appeared in Red Cross rosters or repatriation documents after the war. The patrol had not been recorded as captured, transferred, or executed. A gap in documentation, almost unheard of in the meticulous German war machine. Another clue emerged from a captured German signals officer, Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, interrogated in June 1945. When asked about American prisoners taken in the Ardennes, Brenner recalled an incident near Schönberg. A small patrol, 5 men, maybe, was brought in briefly to a communications outpost. They were interrogated by SS officers, then taken away at dusk. I never saw them again. When pressed for details, Brenner hesitated, claiming he could not remember the specific unit or location. His testimony ended with a haunting remark: they learned something they should not have seen. That statement drew immediate interest from U.S. intelligence analysts. In the post-war scramble to secure Nazi documents and personnel, American and British investigators uncovered evidence of Funkaufklärung, German radio intelligence units operating behind the front lines. Several such teams had been positioned near Schönberg and Losheim during the offensive. These units managed encrypted communications for Kampfgruppe paper and elements of the 6th Panzer Army. If the missing patrol had stumbled across one of these sites, it could have explained their sudden capture and disappearance. By 1946, Captain Knox, now back in the United States, received an unexpected letter from a Belgian priest in St. Vith. The priest, Father Henri Dufresne, claimed that villagers had discovered a shallow depression in the woods the previous summer while collecting timber. Inside, they found fragments of American webbing, buttons, and part of a metal identification tag, though the name had corroded away. When American authorities were notified, a small investigation team visited the site, but it yielded nothing conclusive. Perhaps, Father Dufresne wrote, the forest will not give them back. It is as if it remembers the war better than we do. The Army's Missing Persons Branch reopened the case briefly in 1947 to cross-reference wartime records. By then, the Cold War had begun, and priorities shifted quickly. Many World War II cases were closed to make room for newer operations. Still, some officials remained intrigued. One report from 1948, now declassified, speculated, reconnaissance unit possibly detained by SS intelligence or military police, then executed without record due to secrecy of communications operations in Schönberg sector. If true, it would have been a war crime, one buried under layers of destroyed documentation and silence. For the families back home, none of this mattered. They received only the standard government telegrams. The War Department regrets to inform you that your son remains missing. Efforts to locate him continue. Years passed. Medals were mailed posthumously. Graves were left empty. But the questions persisted. In 1951, during an interview for a veterans newsletter, Captain Knox was asked if he believed the men were still alive when Schönberg fell. He paused before answering, "I think they were alive for a while. And I think someone made sure they disappeared." Decades later, local researchers and military historians began piecing together the puzzle again. In the 1980s, an amateur historian from Liège, Michel Delacroix, examined wartime aerial photographs of the Schönberg area. He identified an unusual pattern near the forest clearing, what appeared to be the remains of camouflaged bunkers and a radio mast, consistent with temporary field intelligence stations used by German Army Group B. Delacroix's findings reignited speculation that the missing Americans had stumbled into one of these secret sites. Still, no bodies, no weapons, and no jeep were ever recovered. The land was eventually reclaimed by forest. Trees grew where soldiers had once bled. Yet the story endured, passed among veteran circles and local Belgian families, retold whenever someone mentioned the strange disappearances that winter. Officially, the case of the vanished patrol remained unresolved. Unofficially, it became a legend whispered in the Ardennes, a tale of men who walked into the snow and vanished between two armies, perhaps silenced because they had seen too much. As one surviving veteran of the 106th later reflected, "There are things in war that get lost, men, records, even truth. But some things don't just go missing. They're taken." And so, the fate of Sergeant Lewis and his men faded into history, their names etched on memorial walls among the countless missing of World War II. Yet for those who knew their story, the question lingered, not only where they died, but why. What had they discovered in the fog of the Ardennes that no one was ever meant to find? Winter, decades later, the Ardennes forest has grown quiet again. The villages rebuilt, the roads repaved, and the scars of 1944 largely hidden beneath layers of moss and pine. But history, as it often does, refuses to rest. In the 1970s, new evidence surfaced that reignited interest in one of the Battle of the Bulge's most haunting mysteries: the vanished U.S. Recon Patrol of the 106th Infantry Division. Their names were still listed as missing in action, yet the story surrounding their disappearance refused to fade. It began when a set of declassified U.S. Army intelligence documents surfaced under the Freedom of Information Act. Among them was a faded report marked "Secret, January 1945. The memo referenced unauthorized contact by U.S. reconnaissance elements with enemy signal operations east of Schönberg. The date, December 16, 1944. 5 men. No follow-up. The language was vague, but the implications were striking. Had the missing patrol stumbled upon something classified, something buried for decades under wartime secrecy? By that time, Cold War analysts were scouring old German archives for intelligence on early encryption and radio interception methods. Within those records, a file labeled Funktrupp 12 of 6 caught the attention of a historian named Dr. Margaret Kohl, who was studying Wehrmacht signal units. The file described a temporary communication site established near Schönberg during the Ardennes offensive, a site that was to be abandoned after compromise by enemy patrol. There were no dates, no captured reports, no mention of prisoners. But the location matched the coordinates of where Sergeant Lewis's patrol had last transmitted before disappearing. Dr. Kohl published her findings in 1981 in the Journal of Military History, proposing that the patrol may have encountered a secret German communications hub and been executed to prevent intelligence leaks. Her paper drew skepticism from some veterans but fascination from others. Soon, amateur historians and even a few surviving members of the 106th began to return to Schönberg, determined to uncover the truth. One of them was retired Sergeant Thomas Haynes, who had led the ill-fated rescue mission in December 1944. Nearly 40 years later, he walked those same forest paths, guided by memory and an old field map. "The trees are bigger now," he told a Belgian journalist, "but the silence feels the same." Haynes and his team discovered what appeared to be remnants of a shallow trench line, and embedded in the soil, a rusted fragment of an American M1 carbine. The serial number was too corroded to read. Still, the find reignited debate about what really happened in that patch of forest. In 1999, Belgian military archaeologists used ground-penetrating radar to survey the Schönberg sector for unexploded ordnance. Unexpectedly, they detected a large metallic mass several meters underground, consistent with the size of a light vehicle. Excavation proved difficult due to soil instability and post-war reforestation, but fragments of U.S. Jeep components were indeed recovered, including a steering column and partial dashboard plate stamped ORD Depth 1944. Unfortunately, there were no human remains nearby. The discovery confirmed only that the patrol's vehicle had been there, and had been deliberately buried. For historians, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. Why bury a Jeep so carefully, in an area far from any recorded skirmish? Who had the time and reason to conceal it? In 2003, a newly opened German archive in Freiburg provided a final, cryptic clue. A handwritten note, recovered from a destroyed field notebook of an SS intelligence officer, referenced 5 Amerikaner aufgegriffen bei Funkstelle, 16/12, Abgeführt durch Einsatzkommando paper. Translated, 5 Americans apprehended at Signal Post, December 16, transferred by paper detachment. The note ended abruptly, with no further elaboration. Whether the men were interrogated, executed, or handed off to another unit remains unknown. Modern researchers and forensic teams have since scoured every lead. No remains, no personal artifacts, and no further documents have surfaced. The families of the missing men were officially notified in 2005 that the case was being closed permanently. Yet even now, visitors to the Schönberg Woods report finding shell fragments, uniform buttons, and bits of gear unearthed by the shifting soil, silent relics of a patrol that never came home. In the closing narration of a 2012 documentary about the case, historian Dr. Cole reflected, "War leaves records, but not always answers. For every hero remembered, there are others erased by circumstance, secrecy, or chance. The men of that patrol were neither lost nor forgotten. They were consumed by the fog that defines every battlefield." Today, a small bronze plaque stands near Schönberg, placed there by local villagers and veterans of the 106th Division. It reads simply, "In memory of those who vanished in December 1944. Their watch continues." The mystery of the vanished U.S. Recon patrol endures, part truth, part silence, entirely human. Perhaps they were victims of chaos, perhaps of secrecy. What is certain is that, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the line between survival and disappearance was as thin as the fog that swallowed them. The forest keeps its secret still, and beneath its quiet pines, history whispers the names of 5 men who drove into the mist and were never seen again.